The sun hung low over the Zambara Grasslands, casting a burning amber hue across the endless savannah. Every blade of grass shimmered gold beneath the twilight sky, and the earth breathed with the hush of approaching night. It was the kind of silence that only nature could summon, majestic, vast, and deceptive. Cutting through this silence, a pride of lions moved like shadows through the tall grass. Leading them was Ruko, a powerful male lion with a bright golden mane that flared in the light like fire. His steps were heavy, deliberate, each paw pressed a mark of authority. Close behind, 5 lionesses followed in perfect formation. Their eyes gleamed like amber glass, scanning the horizon for the subtle twitch of prey. Together they were beautiful and dangerous, forged by instinct and unity. Ruko paused near the edge of a thinning tree line, nose flaring. Something in the air wasn't right. Zambara was wild, yes, but not untouched. In recent months, whispers of illegal rhino poaching had turned into stark evidence. Steel traps, cruel and hidden, were being scattered across the reserve by those who valued horn over life. Ruko didn't know of poachers or metal, but he knew this scent was wrong. It stung with cold and iron. He turned away from the pride, slipping into the underbrush, alone. His ears twitched. He moved slowly, muscles coiled, sniffing the ground with caution. Then it happened. A sharp metallic snap cut through the still air, followed by a roar so raw it shattered the calm. Like glass, birds exploded from the trees. Ruko thrashed in the dirt, one of his massive front legs clamped in a hidden steel trap. Blood immediately darkened the dry earth beneath him. His cry echoed far and wide. Within seconds, the lionesses emerged from the grass like spirits called to battle. They didn't hesitate. They surrounded Ruko, forming a silent wall of muscle and vigilance. Their growls were low and urgent, their eyes darting between Ruko and the dark forest beyond. He tried to pull free once, twice, but each time the trap dug deeper into his leg. His roars turned into labored grunts, his strength draining with every futile tug. He collapsed onto his sides, heaving leg trembling. The lionesses didn't leave. They circled him, brushing their heads against his mane, pressing their bodies close as if their presence could ease the pain. One of them, younger and smaller, tried licking the wound, only to flinch back at the smell of blood and metal. The trap was never meant for lions. It was designed for rhinos, thick-skinned, heavy beasts, and it gripped Ruko's leg with brutal precision. Night began to fall. The sky shifted from orange to violet as the sun dipped below the horizon. The wind picked up, rustling the trees like whispers in a cathedral. But still the pride stayed. They didn't hunt, they didn't sleep, they just stayed with him. Somewhere beyond the trees, a pair of headlights blinked through the dust. And so began a night that would test the bond between predator and protector, beast and man. The night air settled cold and thick over the Zambara Grasslands. A soft mist slithered along the ground, chilling the cracked earth, where Ruko lay, trapped, his massive body heaving with shallow breaths. The golden light had faded into a deep indigo, and only the stars bore witness to his pain. Around him, the 5 lionesses formed a living barrier. They didn't sleep, they didn't wander. They stood vigil, their bodies low and tense, ears flicking at every sound from the forest edge. Mara, the lead lioness, paced a slow, restless circle around Ruko. Her muscles rippled with unease. She knew every breath he took was harder than the last. At one point, the youngest lioness, barely past cubhood, ventured too close to the blood-soaked trap. With a startled whimper, she caught her paw on a buried shard of metal near the device. A sharp yelp broke the quiet, and Mara was instantly at her side, guiding her back with a nudge of her head. The damage was minor, a shallow cut, but it was a brutal reminder this place was poisoned by unseen hands. Above them, storm clouds began to gather, dark and heavy. A soft drizzle kissed the ground, turning dust to thin mud. The world shrank into shadow and silence, broken only by the low, ragged groans of Ruko. Then far in the distance came a different sound, the low rumble of an engine gyro. A young and relatively new ranger was finishing his late patrol. His jeep bumped along the narrow dirt trail, headlights slicing through the mist. His shift was supposed to end an hour ago, but something had compelled him to drive just a little farther. When he heard the faint roar earlier, he'd almost convinced himself it was just thunder. Almost now a second roar, weaker, more desperate, curled through the trees. He braked hard, hammering, and grabbed his flashlight and tranquilizer rifle. He wasn't sure what he would find, but his gut screamed that something was wrong. Stepping carefully through the wet grass, he followed the sound. Then he saw them in the dim light of his torch. A massive male lion collapsed on the ground. A cruel steel trap clamped tight around his foreleg, blood pooling darkly underneath. Around him, 5 lionesses glared at Jairo with raw suspicion. Their golden eyes, catching the beam of his light like coins in a well instinct, screamed at him to back away. But something in Ruko's gaze held him still. There was no malice there, no rage, only unbearable exhaustion, a silent plea. Jairo cursed under his breath. He considered running back to his jeep, calling for backup, but he knew the radio would be useless this deep into Zambra. No signal, no time. And judging by the snarled mess of steel and blood, he was certain this was a poacher's trap designed for rhinos capable of holding a 2-ton beast. If he left now, Ruko would be dead by sunrise. If not by blood loss, then by the poachers themselves returning to collect. Jairo swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on his chest. Alone, unarmed, outnumbered, but he couldn't turn away. He shifted his tranquilizer rifle to one side, raising both hands slowly to show he meant no harm. The lionesses growled low, a warning in their throats, but they didn't move. Step by step, heart pounding in his ears, Jairo approached the wounded king of Zambra, stepping into a circle of wild trust few humans would ever dare enter. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled softly. Time and perhaps fate itself was running out. Jairo's boots squelched softly in the mud as he moved closer. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run. The lionesses, tense and coiled like springs, watched his every step. One wrong move, one stumble, and this night could end in blood. But Ruko didn't move. The massive lion just lay their sides, heaving golden eyes locked onto Jairo's, not with anger, not with fear, but with something deeper, a broken kind of hope. Jairo knelt cautiously a few feet away, feeling the cold sweat trickling down his spine. He placed the tranquilizer rifle on the ground out of arm's reach, an act of surrender. His hands shook as he reached for the trap. The steel was thick, rusted, and cruel. Designed for rhinos, not lions, its jagged jaws bit deeply into Ruko's flesh, and the lion's blood, dark and sticky, seeped into the cracked earth. Jairo gritted his teeth. He pulled a multi-tool from his belt, fumbling with the locking mechanism. The first attempt failed. The second, too. Panic gnawed at the edges of his mind. The trap was jammed with dirt and blood, almost fused shut by the force of impact. Suddenly, from the trees beyond, a low mechanical rumble echoed. Jairo froze. Headlights in the distance bobbing over the uneven ground. Poachers. He knew it instantly, the way the lights zigzagged. No regard for the paths rangers used. They were coming back to check their traps. If they found him here with a wounded lion surrounded by its pride, they would not hesitate to kill. Humans were always more dangerous than animals out here. Adrenaline surged through him, drowning out fear. He leaned closer to the trap, muttering under his breath, "Come on, come on!" Behind him, the lionesses shifted their tails, twitching low. Mara, the largest, let out a soft, throaty growl, not directed at him, but at the approaching threat. They knew too. Jairo jammed his fingers into the locking hinge again. This time the rusty metal groaned. He heaved muscles, straining pain, shooting up his arms. The trap clattered open. For a split second, everything stood still. Ruko's massive body flinched in pain, but he didn't lash out. Instead, he simply lifted his bloodied paw, letting it fall free from the iron jaws. Jairo staggered back, gasping for air. The lionesses surged forward, not to attack, but to press around Ruko, their bodies creating a living shield. The approaching vehicle grew louder. Jairo had no choice. He grabbed the heavy steel trap, hauling it awkwardly in his arms, and stumbled back toward his jeep. He shoved the trap into the back seat and yanked open his emergency kit. No time for perfection, only instinct. He sprinted back to Ruko, who was struggling to lift his great head. Jairo knelt, working fast disinfectant spray pressure bandages, whatever he could manage in the dim, shaking light of his flashlight. The lionesses hovered close, their low growls vibrating the air, but they didn't stop him. When he injected a mild painkiller just under Ruko's fur, the lion flinched but didn't attack. He understood. The headlights now burned brighter, closer. Jairo wiped his forehead with a bloodied sleeve. He didn't know if he had minutes or seconds left, but he knew this: he wasn't leaving without giving Ruko a fighting chance. Somewhere behind the trees, the poacher's engine sputtered, stalled, then roared again. Jairo whispered to Ruko words he knew the lion couldn't understand but needed to say anyway. "Hold on, King, just a little longer." The night crackled with electricity. The final act was about to begin. The roar of the engine ripped through the trees like a warning shot. Jairo crouched low, heart hammering against his ribs as the battered pickup truck skidded into the clearing. Its headlights sliced the mist, catching the sheen of blood on the ground, the glint of the abandoned trap. Inside the cab, two men stared out, both rough, dirty, and armed. One of them pointed directly at Jairo. The poacher's instinct screamed at Jairo to run, to jump into his jeep and floor it back toward the safety of the outpost. But he didn't move, because behind him 5 lionesses stood in a defensive arc around Ruko, their bodies stiff muscles, coiled fangs glinting in the stark light. And Ruko, battered and bleeding, had somehow risen to his feet. The poacher's engine sputtered, idling uneasily. The man in the passenger seat raised a rifle, shouting something Jairo couldn't hear, over the roar in his ears, his hands clenched into fists. He couldn't let them take this. Not tonight. Before the poachers could act, Mara stepped forward. Her ears pinned back, her body low. She let out a low, rumbling snarl, a sound that seemed to vibrate the earth itself. The poachers hesitated. The man with the gun yelled again, this time shriller panic edging into his voice. The other tried to back up the truck, but the wheels spun uselessly in the mud. In that frozen second, Jairo realized they weren't just looking at lions. They were looking at a wall of fury, of loyalty, of something ancient and unstoppable, and the wild was no longer on their side. With a sudden, synchronized burst of movement, the lionesses surged forward, not attacking blindly, but rushing just close enough to send a deafening message. The poachers panicked. The rifle clattered onto the floor of the truck as the driver threw the vehicle into reverse. Mud sprayed into the air as the pickup lurched backward, spinning wildly, headlights bouncing across the trees. Within seconds, the truck vanished into the darkness, leaving only the stench of burned rubber and fear behind. Silence reclaimed the clearing. Jairo didn't dare move at first. His breathing was ragged, his body wired tight as a bowstring. Then Mara turned her massive head, fixing him with an unwavering gaze. For one terrifying moment, he thought she might finish what the poacher started, but instead she blinked slowly, deliberately, and back toward Ruko. The pride reformed around their king, brushing against him in silent solidarity. Jairo sank to his knees in the mud, overcome. They had protected him, not out of trust, not out of gratitude perhaps, but because in that brief sliver of time, he had become part of something bigger than himself. He was no longer just a ranger, no longer just a man. For one breathtaking moment, he belonged to the wild. Ruko limped forward, every step stiff with pain but full of purpose. He stopped just a few feet from Jairo. Their eyes met, man and beast, no fear, no anger, only an understanding, as old as the earth itself. Jairo bowed his head, offering the only gesture he could. When he lifted it again, the lions were already slipping into the night, silent as spirits above them. The first stars bloomed across the velvet sky, and Jairo knew deep in his bones this night would never leave him. Not for as long as he lived. The days that followed felt different. The sun still rose over the Zambara Grasslands, still painted the sky in fiery hues. But for Jairo, everything had shifted. The world seemed bigger now, deeper, somehow filled with a silent language. He was only beginning to understand. Every afternoon after his patrol rounds, he found himself steering the dusty jeep back toward the clearing where it had all happened. He would park at a respectful distance, kill the engine, and just sit, listening, watching. Most days there was nothing but the whisper of dry grass and the distant cries of birds. But sometimes when the wind was just right, he would catch a flicker of movement in the trees, a flash of tawny fur, a glint of golden mane. Ruko. He never came too close. He would linger on the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the thorn bushes, watching, always watching. At first, Jairo thought it might be a coincidence, but then it happened again and again. Sometimes the lionesses were there too, Mara among them, silent, steady presences under the wide African sky. They didn't roar, they didn't threaten, they simply existed alongside him. As days blurred into weeks, an unspoken ritual formed. Jairo would arrive, Ruko would appear. They would acknowledge each other sometimes with a long, steady glance, sometimes with a subtle shift of posture. Then as the sun began to dip, Jairo would nod quietly, start his engine and drive away. And Ruko would watch until he disappeared into the dust. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't ownership. It was something purer, a bond forged not by dominance, but by trust, by survival, by a night when two worlds collided and chose not to destroy each other. One afternoon when the dry season had stripped the land bare, Jairo noticed something new. Tracks, massive paw prints trailing behind his Jeep's tire marks for nearly 5 kilometers. He smiled to himself, a soft private thing. The king of Zambara wasn't just watching him anymore. He was escorting him, a silent guardian of the wild, paying respect in the only way he knew. Jairo never spoke of it to the other rangers. Some things were too sacred to explain. Instead, he kept it locked in his heart, the memory of standing alone under the weight of a lion's gaze, knowing he had been measured not by his strength, not by his weapons, but by his choices. In a world where greed and cruelty so often wrote the story, they had carved out something different, something better. The wild, it seemed, had not given up hope for man just yet. One evening, as the first stars pricked the indigo sky, Jairo sat by the clearing one last time before heading back to base. Across the open plain, Ruko stood tall, silhouetted against the fading light. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with the slow majesty of the land itself, Ruko dipped his massive head, a gesture of peace, of recognition, of a promise. Kept Jairo returned the nod, feeling a lump rise in his throat. As he turned the key in the ignition and the old Jeep rumbled to life, he whispered into the warm night air, "Goodbye, my friend, until we meet again." And somewhere beyond the grass and stars, the king watched, steady and silent, as the man drove away carrying the memory of their bond into a world that desperately needed to remember it.